How Not to Sail, sponsored by Latitudes and Attitudes. They ruined my life, so why not let them ruin yours today at latsats.com. So I'm headed south in my boat Jacie Sails after stopping at Cabbage Key. I'm making for Marco Island to anchor overnight before making the long leap to Marathon in the Florida Keys. As always, if you haven't heard the previous episodes, I encourage you to start with episode 1. A lot has gone on before now. But the short story is, I have about 6 days left to make it 250 nautical miles to Miami to meet the Admiral and to meet Bob Bitchin at the Miami Boat Show to launch this podcast. If you don't know who Bob Bitchin is, or even if you do, well, that's another reason to start with episode 1. But if you're the stubborn type, feel free to carry on.
Remind me why you're doing this again?
Because otherwise there's no story. It's That's Tanya, but we call her the Admiral. She was initially skeptical of my idea to make this trip. But I figure what better way to launch this podcast than to sail alone from St. Pete around Florida to the Miami Boat Show. The spring issue of Bob Bitchin's magazine, Cruising Outpost, will be available at the boat show, and my ad for the How Not to Sail podcast is scheduled to be in it. I've also had 1,000 postcards for the How Not to Sail launch printed up, and I'm handing them out on the way. It seems like a great plan to me. All I need to do is avoid any more propulsion problems, or any other surprises, and get me and my sailboat over to Miami in time to meet Tanya's flight, make it to the boat show, and have all of my plans come together. What could possibly go wrong? So I mentioned my sailboat, Jacie Sails, and I think it's about time we met her. Jacie Sails, technically speaking, is a 37-foot cutter-rigged sailboat weighing 18,000 pounds. Jacie Sails, in reality, is a floating temple, my fortress of solitude. Her main purpose, her prime directive, is to make me happy. Not everybody I've had aboard gets that. There are folks who, like me, appreciate the natural beauty around us, or the sounds of the sea that you hear when you turn off the engine. Then there are the folks who want to get drunk and chatter about nothing. You can guess which group I prefer to have aboard. I've started using the word crew instead of the word guests. Maybe that will help. Now, I wasn't always this grumpy, about boats anyway. In fact, even though I'd gotten hooked on the idea of sailing, it took about 20 years and a bit of random luck before I ran across my floating temple. I have a certain friend who shall remain nameless, Todd, you know who you are, who, shall we say, has a lot more capacity for detail than I do. Todd was interested in buying a sailboat, and to that end, he created a spreadsheet comparing various boats in terms of fuel and water capacity, sea kindliness, and all manner of other things. It was quite impressive. Todd eventually decided to purchase a motorcycle. I arrived at my boat purchase via a slightly different methodology. I dressed up as Blackbeard for Halloween, and a boat fell into my lap just a couple of days later.
Hey, Tanya, it's Jay. I was just calling about the boat.
Our friend Captain Elmore had looked at a 1983 Hunter Cherubini sailboat on Lake Lanier near Atlanta. He swore Tanya to secrecy until he had a chance to decide if he wanted to buy the boat, which at the time was named Bon's Voyage.
I decided I'm not going to buy it. Do you want me to let Bradford know about it?
Fortunately for me, Captain Elmore's wife Susan didn't enjoy the breezy test drive, so he gave Tanya the go-ahead to clue me in. At first, I wasn't as interested in the opportunity as Tanya was. I had my eye set on an ocean boat, not a lake boat, and it seemed like a major operation to move a cruising sailboat to the ocean. But Jay's recommendation and Tanya's enthusiasm were enough to get me up to the lake on a Saturday to take a look. I didn't know what to expect when we parked on the hilltop at Sunrise Cove Marina and walked down the hillside to the docks. But there in slip J28 was a clean, well-kept white boat with blue trim. Well, okay, like 90% of fiberglass boats are white with blue trim, but that's another story. The inside was neat and tidy. Thomas and Lisa had been meticulous in their upkeep, and since the boat had been in fresh, temperate Georgia waters for years, corrosion and rust were about zero. I have to admit to you here, I have this ability to zone out on details and information when it suits me. Honestly, my assessment of the boat was, yep, neat, tidy, looks good to me. We took her out for a spin. I'm sure I managed to sound like I was having a conversation, but my mind was far away in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. I'm not sure if I'd decided to buy her yet, but the fat lady was warming up in the green room, as they say. We brought the boat back to the dock and chatted about something or other. I had no idea what potential problems to look for, so my survey consisted of lifting up the cabin sole, snapping a smartphone picture of the keel bolts, and sending them to Captain Elmore and also Captain Kernodle, who saw nothing amiss with the keel bolts. It was up to me now. Thomas and Lisa had another appointment the next day with a potential buyer. I weighed my decision carefully. Okay, I didn't really. I talked to Captain Elmore and Captain Kernodle, who both thought that for the asking price I should have a nice boat to meet my needs, and that I could make all manner of modifications and still be way under the cost of a new boat. I showed up the next day, checkbook in hand, like a damned idiot. And speaking of checkbooks, it's time to pay the bills for 30 seconds, and I'll be right back.
Smooth seas and blue skies.
Bob had a problem. You see, Bob had a magazine. And then Bob ran into some trouble and lost his magazine, Latitudes and Attitudes. But guess what? America's #1 boating lifestyle magazine is back again as Latitudes and Attitudes. Check it out today at latsats.com.
Yeah, so that's pretty much the story. The cruising magazine that I got into cruising with, Latitudes and Attitudes, transformed into Cruising Outpost after Bob Bitchin got screwed over by a very unscrupulous fellow who shut down their offices and moved to South America. Or something like that. But now they're back as Latitudes and Attitudes, and we are super happy about that. But meanwhile, I'm standing on J-Dock at Lake Lanier with a checkbook in my hand, like a damned idiot. Thomas and Lisa were asking $25,000 for Bon's Voyage. I knew my dad wouldn't be proud unless I haggled a little, so I offered $24,000 on the spot. They accepted. I was now the proud owner of a 9-ton, 37-foot boat. A boat whose name held meaning only for the current owners. But I already had a name in mind. A name I'd been saving for years. And it goes back to when I met the Admiral. When I first called upon Tanya at her home, she had a dog. And I was worried. Not because I don't like dogs. I do. But I have certain criteria. They must be of a certain size, no smaller than a beagle generally. They must be short to medium-haired, and the hair must be straight, no curly-haired dogs. And they must not yap. Jacie met the minimum size requirement.
White, long white hair, medium-sized dog.
And I'd call it medium-length hair when she had a trim. Just at the outer end of the hair length requirement. But the tail worried me. Jacie's white tail curled around in a plume reminiscent of something on a Roman centurion's helmet. The The tail didn't seem to belong on what otherwise seemed to be a plump, short-legged Spitz mix. This, I thought, could be a frou-frou dog. As it turns out, though, Jacie was amazing. She was super chill and lovable. Tanya could let her out the back door and she would stay in the yard and do her thing, eventually inchworming back up the steps like a seal. You see, Jacie had some physical challenges.
She had a perfect first position.
What's first position?
Hyperextended for a dog, pushed out to the right and the left. It was a little daunting for her, for sure.
Jacie's poor feet were so arthritic that when she laid down, it looked like her forelegs were crossed. They were not.
She tended to look like a penguin periodically.
But Jacie was a gamer, and she took to me right away. One night after I moved in with Tanya, I was out playing a gig, and Tanya couldn't find Jacie.
I was home, and generally she would sit and watch TV with me or stay with me for most of the time. And there was this one evening when I could not locate her, which was bizarre. She was always on my heels. I eventually found her in the guest bedroom where your desk was set up, and she was laying underneath it, obviously missing you.
Well, who could blame her? Anyway, since I worked at home during the day, Jacie became my constant companion. Unfortunately, she was already pretty old when I came along, and our time together wasn't nearly long enough. Besides the severe arthritis, she had pancreatic cancer. Then she developed glaucoma, so the Admiral and I got her a prosthetic eye. But her time with us was running out. She began to have a terrible cough that turned out to be congestive heart failure. Finally, one day, we had to make that last visit to the vet. As Tanya and I said our goodbyes, I made a promise to Jacie. I don't know what happens after this, I said, but I'll never forget you. Those words still haunt me. Because just like Daisy and Ginger, who passed away only last year, it wasn't long before I started to forget. I didn't want to forget Jacie. I cried as they put her to sleep, and I cried on the way home. But then I stopped, and all the vivid details about Jacie began to fade. I don't know why, and I don't think it bodes well for my golden years if I ever see them. I wish I could hold everything about Jacie and Daisy and Ginger in my mind, even if it makes losing them that much more painful. But I just can't. I did do something to honor Jacie, though. And as best I remember, I already had it in mind when we took her in for the last time. A lot of boats have names having to do with the wind, stars, islands, relaxation, and, let's face it, women. Far too many, in my opinion, involve some play on the word naughty or not. My boat may not be the easiest name to understand over the VHF radio or to folks from other countries, but one thing I'm sure of, it's unique. Our dog Jacie never got to go sailing. It took me another decade to get my sailboat, but I remembered my promise. After getting 5 months of sailing practice in on Lake Lanier and meeting some great folks, I had the boat hauled out, put on a semi with her mast removed, and trucked down to St. Pete, where on June 22, 2013, after a substantial refit, Jack Coletti from Midnight Oil Workshop pulled the transfer paper off her transom to reveal her new name, Jacie Sails. As I make my way south out of Fort Myers Beach toward Marco Island, I walk along the cabin top and stand next to the mast. I can feel the solidity of Jacie Sails under me, and I'm thinking back to the christening of this floating temple.
Okay.
Cheers. After we installed her in her new home in Gulfport, Florida, Tanya and I took Jacie Sails about 10 miles off St. Pete Beach, where, in 40 feet of water, we broke a bottle of champagne over the bow and consigned Jacie's ashes to the sea. Maybe Jacie did get to go sailing after all. Be sure to join us next episode as I make the leap south toward Marathon Key and the Miami Boat Show. What could possibly go wrong? Big thanks to everyone who's left the nice 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere, and everybody who's jumped on the email list. I couldn't possibly be more grateful. Don't miss out on the show notes at hownottosail.com/5. That's the number 5 for all kind of pictures, video, and the PDF script for this episode. You can find the show notes for any episode that way, by the way. You can also get in on the Facebook group by just going to hownottosail.com/community. You can also catch me on the Twitters at hownottosail and on Instagram at Bradford Rogers. I sure appreciate you listening, and I'll see you next time on How Not to Sail. Screwing up is part of cruising. Let me show you how.